The millionaire's dog digs relentlessly in the garden. When the man sees what's in the hole, he is completely shocked. The late afternoon sun bathed the expansive gardens of the Hawthorne mansion, tinting golden the roses that Elizabeth had loved so much. Richard Hawthorne, seated in his favorite armchair by the window, watched melancholically as shadows lengthened across the perfectly manicured lawn. At 68 years old, each sunset brought the weight of memories and the loneliness that had enveloped him since Elizabeth's passing. Max, the 12-year-old Labrador who had been his wife's last gift, rested at his feet. The dog lifted his head and looked at his master with those deep eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the world. Richard leaned down to stroke his golden fur, finding comfort in the familiar warmth of his companion. "You know, Max, sometimes I wonder if she knew you'd be much more than a pet to me," Richard murmured, as his fingers tangled in the animal's soft coat. The dog responded with a soft whimper, as if he perfectly understood the weight of his master's words. The mansion, with its wide hallways and sumptuous rooms, had become a museum of memories. Every corner held Elizabeth's essence, her favorite books in the library, her paintings on the walls, the piano she played on Sunday afternoons. The fortune Richard had accumulated over the years seemed empty without her to share it. Mrs. Peterson, the longtime housekeeper who had served the family for decades, entered the room silently with a tea tray. Her soft, measured steps revealed years of practice in moving through the house without disturbing its inhabitants. "Your afternoon tea, Mr. Hawthorne," she announced softly. "And the cookies that Max likes so much." Richard nodded in gratitude, watching as the elderly woman set the tray on the side table. Mrs. Peterson had been more than an employee. She was a link to the past, a silent witness to his history with Elizabeth. "Mrs. Peterson, have you noticed anything strange about Max lately?" Richard asked, as the dog got up and approached the cookies. The woman paused for a moment, as if carefully considering her response. "Well, sir, I've seen him very restless in the garden, especially near the large rose bush where Mrs. Elizabeth used to sit." Richard frowned. He too had noticed changes in Max's behavior over the past few weeks. The dog spent hours in the garden, digging in specific places with an almost obsessive determination. It wasn't typical behavior for an elderly dog that should be more interested in sleeping than digging. "Maybe he misses Elizabeth," Richard suggested, more to himself than to Mrs. Peterson. But even as he spoke those words, something inside told him there was more to the story. The evening light was beginning to fade when Max suddenly got up, his ears alert and his body tense. He headed towards the door leading to the garden, looking at Richard insistently. "What's wrong, friend?" Richard asked, rising from his chair. The Labrador barked softly, a sound that seemed more like an invitation than a warning. Mrs. Peterson observed the scene with an indescribable expression. "Mrs. Elizabeth always said Max was special, sir, that he saw things we couldn't see." Mrs. Peterson's words resonated in Richard's mind as he followed Max into the garden. The evening air was cool, and the scent of roses filled the atmosphere. The dog headed decisively towards a specific point near the main rose bush, where he began to dig with renewed vigor. "Max, stop," Richard ordered, concerned for his precious rose bushes. But the Labrador continued his task with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. It was then that Richard noticed something shiny in the disturbed earth. He approached, intrigued, and knelt beside Max. With trembling hands, he extracted an object from the ground, an old silver medal blackened by time but with a name clearly visible engraved on the reverse. Elizabeth. The world seemed to stop as Richard held the medal in his hands. Memories hit him like a wave. Elizabeth laughing in that very garden, planting roses while Max faithfully followed her, whispering secrets in the dog's ear when she thought no one was watching. "What other secrets do you keep, old friend?" Richard murmured, looking at Max with new eyes. The dog returned his gaze, and for a moment Richard swore he saw a flash of knowledge in those brown eyes. Night was beginning to fall over the Hawthorne mansion, and with it, the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Max had initiated something, a quest that promised to unearth more than just lost objects. On the horizon, the first stars appeared, silent witnesses to a mystery that was just beginning to unfold. The medal rested on the mahogany desk in Richard's study, glowing faintly under the lamplight. He had spent a restless night, tossing and turning in his king-size bed, too large for a lone man. while his mind filled with unanswered questions. Why had Elizabeth buried that medal? What other secrets did his garden hold? Dawn found him in his study, examining the medal for the umpteenth time. It was a precious object, with intricate Art Nouveau details snaking around Elizabeth's name. He vaguely remembered seeing it before, but couldn't place exactly when or where. Max entered the study with a calm step, his tail moving gently. He sat next to Richard and rested his head on his master's knee, as he had done so many times before. "Good morning, old friend," Richard murmured, stroking the dog's ears. "What other mysteries do you hold for me?" The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Peterson appeared at the door, carrying a tray with coffee and freshly baked bread. "Mr. Hawthorne, you should eat something. You haven't had a bite since yesterday," the woman said in that maternal tone she had developed over the years. Richard nodded distractedly, but his eyes remained fixed on the medal. "Mrs. Peterson, do you remember this medal? Did Elizabeth wear it?" The old woman approached, adjusting her glasses to examine the object better. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, yes, sir. Mrs. Elizabeth wore it on special occasions. It was a gift from her grandmother, if I'm not mistaken, but I thought it had been lost years ago." "Lost?" Richard looked up, intrigued. "When?" Mrs. Peterson frowned, recalling. "It was shortly before she passed. I remember she was very upset looking for it. She spent days checking every corner of the house." A blurry memory emerged in Richard's mind. Elizabeth, pale and worried, rummaging through drawers and closets. At that time, he had been too busy with his business to pay real attention to her distress. Now that memory caused him a pang of guilt. Max suddenly got up, heading towards the window overlooking the garden. His behavior was different from the day before, more cautious, as if he were alerting about something or someone. Richard approached the window and saw a familiar figure walking among the rose bushes. Thomas Blackwood, his former neighbor and business partner. The man, dressed in an impeccable grey suit, seemed to be inspecting the garden with particular interest. "I didn't know Mr. Blackwood was coming today," Mrs. Peterson commented, in a tone that suggested some disapproval. "Neither did I," Richard replied, watching as Max began to growl softly. The dog had never shown aggression towards visitors, but something about Thomas seemed to deeply disturb him. The doorbell of the main entrance resonated through the mansion. Richard quickly put the medal in the drawer of his desk, an instinctive action that even he didn't fully understand. "Good morning, my dear friend." Thomas's voice filled the study moments later. "I was passing through the neighborhood and thought I'd pay you a visit." Richard turned to face his visitor, noticing the way Thomas's eyes scanned the room, as if looking for something specific. "Thomas, what a surprise. I haven't seen you since Elizabeth's funeral," Thomas completed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Too long, don't you think?" Max positioned himself between the two men, his posture tense and vigilant. Thomas looked at the dog with a mixture of annoyance and something else, concern. "I see you still keep the dog," Thomas commented, keeping his distance from Max. "It must be difficult to maintain the garden in order with him digging everywhere." The way Thomas mentioned Max's digging made Richard tense. How did he know about that? Had he been watching the mansion? "Max is part of the family," Richard responded firmly, "and the garden is perfectly fine." Mrs. Peterson, who had remained silent, intervened. "Mr. Hawthorne, would you like me to serve coffee for Mr. Blackwood?" "That won't be necessary," Thomas hastened to say. "I just came to remember old times and to make sure my friend is doing well." The conversation continued with superficial topics, but Richard could feel an underlying tension. Every time Thomas tried to steer the chat towards Elizabeth or the past, Max growled softly, like a warning. When Thomas finally left, Richard stood looking out the window, watching him leave. Max's behavior, the sudden appearance of the medal, Thomas's unexpected visit, everything seemed to be connected in some way he couldn't yet understand. "Sir," Mrs. Peterson's voice interrupted his thoughts. "There's something you should know about Mrs. Elizabeth and Mr. Blackwood." Richard turned to look at his housekeeper, but before he could speak, Max began to bark insistently, heading once again towards the garden. This time his barks had a tone of urgency that couldn't be ignored. Max's barks led Richard and Mrs. Peterson to the western section of the garden, where the camellias Elizabeth had planted years ago formed a small maze of shrubs. The mid-morning sun illuminated the flowers, creating a spectacle of light and shadow among the foliage. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" Richard asked, following the Labrador who moved with determination between the bushes. The dog stopped in front of a marble bench, Elizabeth's favorite. It was a special place. She had spent countless afternoons there reading, painting, or simply contemplating the garden. Max began to dig near one of the bench's legs with the same intensity he had shown the day before. "Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Peterson began, her voice trembling slightly. "Before Max finds whatever he's looking for, I need to tell you something about Mrs. Elizabeth." Richard turned to her, noting the concern on her wrinkled face. "What is it, Mrs. Peterson?" The elderly woman sat on the marble bench, her hands clasped in her lap. "Mrs. Elizabeth made me promise to take care of you and Max after she was gone, but she also asked me to keep silent about certain things until the right time came." "What things?" Richard asked, feeling his heart race. "Mrs. Elizabeth noticed changes in you, sir. Changes that began shortly after Mr. Blackwood became your partner. She saw how ambition began to consume you, how the decisions you made in your business started to drift away from your original values." Mrs. Peterson's words hit Richard like a slap. He sat next to her, while Max continued his task, now more slowly, as if he too was listening. "Elizabeth never told me anything," Richard murmured. "She tried, sir, many times, but you were so focused on building your empire that her warnings fell on deaf ears. That's when she started writing in her diary and burying things in the garden." "Burying things like the medal?" Mrs. Peterson nodded. "The medal was just the beginning. There's more, much more. Mrs. Elizabeth believed that someday you would need to remember who you truly were, and she left clues to help you find your way back to yourself." At that moment, Max barked softly. He had unearthed something, a small metal box rusted by time and humidity. Richard took it with trembling hands. Upon opening it, he found a man's ring, elegant but discreet. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Daniel Roberts, his old friend and partner, before Thomas came into the picture. "Daniel," Richard whispered, as memories flooded his mind. He remembered the accusations, the carefully constructed lies, the betrayal he had orchestrated along with Thomas to push Daniel out of the company. "Mrs. Elizabeth knew the truth about what happened with Mr. Roberts," Mrs. Peterson continued. "She investigated on her own, gathered evidence. Mr. Blackwood found out and started watching her." Watching her! Richard felt the air leave his lungs. "Why didn't you ever tell me before?" "Because she made me swear I would wait. Max will know when the time is right," she told me. "He will guide Richard when he's ready to face the truth." Max approached Richard and rested his head on his lap, as if consoling him. His brown eyes seemed to contain all the wisdom and love that Elizabeth had deposited in him. "There's more, Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Mrs. Elizabeth didn't just hide objects in the garden. She also kept documents, evidence that could change everything. But she knew that Mr. Blackwood was also looking for that evidence. That's why he came today," Richard realized. "It wasn't a casual visit. No, sir, Mr. Blackwood has been watching the mansion since Max started digging. He knows that if the evidence comes to light—" A noise in the bushes interrupted Mrs. Peterson. Max became alert, growling towards the direction of the sound. When Richard turned, he caught sight of a shadow quickly moving away. "We're not alone," Mrs. Peterson whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Mr. Blackwood has eyes everywhere." Richard clutched the ring in his hand, feeling the weight of his past decisions. Elizabeth had woven a network of clues and truths, using the garden as her treasure chest and Max as its guardian. Now, as the morning sun bathed the garden, Richard understood that he was in a race against time, not only to uncover the truth, but to protect the legacy that Elizabeth had left under the custody of her faithful Labrador. Max approached another point in the garden, his behavior suggesting there was more to discover. Richard looked at Mrs. Peterson, who nodded softly. "Follow him, sir," said the old woman. "Max will never lead you down the wrong path." Evening fell over the Hawthorne mansion as Richard contemplated Daniel's ring in his study. Each time he turned it between his fingers, the memories became sharper, more painful. Daniel's face on the day he betrayed him, the trust in his eyes transforming into disbelief, into pain. "How could I, Elizabeth?" he murmured to himself, while Max watched him from his place next to the unlit fireplace. "How could I let ambition blind me like that?" The sound of the phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Thomas again. "Richard, dear friend." Thomas's honeyed voice sounded through the receiver. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. How about we have dinner together, for old time's sake?" Something in Thomas's tone made Richard tense. Max, sensing his unease, approached and rested his head on his knee. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm not feeling well tonight," Richard replied, stroking Max's head. "Maybe another time." "As you wish, my friend, but remember that there are things from the past that are better left buried." The veiled threat in Thomas's words did not go unnoticed. After hanging up, Richard headed towards the library, faithfully followed by Max. Among Elizabeth's books, he found a photo album he hadn't opened in years. The images told a story he had tried to forget. He and Daniel, young and full of dreams, founding their first company. Elizabeth and Daniel's wife, Sarah, laughing together during Sunday dinners. Max, just a puppy, playing in the garden while the four shared afternoons of coffee and hopes. "Sir," Mrs. Peterson's voice pulled him from his memories. "I found something you should see." The old woman handed him a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter from Elizabeth, dated 1 week before her passing. "My dear Richard, there are truths too heavy to carry in silence. For years, I have kept secrets that have consumed me as much as the illness that now takes me from you. But I cannot leave without making sure that someday you will know the truth. Daniel was innocent. The documents that incriminated him were fabricated by Thomas. I discovered this years ago, but by then, the damage was already done. Daniel had lost everything, his reputation, his company, even Sarah, who couldn't bear the scandal. You'll wonder why I didn't tell you before. I tried, my love, in so many ways. But you had built walls so high around your conscience that my words couldn't reach you. That's when I began to bury the evidence in our garden, trusting that someday you would be ready to find it. Max will be your guide. He always knew more than we imagined. Trust him as I trusted. With eternal love, Elizabeth." Richard's hands trembled as he finished reading. Max approached and gently licked his fingers, as if wanting to erase the pain that Elizabeth's words had brought. "Sarah," Richard murmured. "What became of her, Mrs. Peterson?" The old woman sighed deeply. She left the country after the scandal. Mrs. Elizabeth kept in secret contact with her. It was she who told her about the truth behind the falsified documents. Max suddenly headed towards the window, his ears alert. In the garden, a figure moved among the shadows of twilight. "It's one of Mr. Blackwood's men," Mrs. Peterson whispered. "They've been watching the house since the excavations began." Richard approached the window, observing how the figure disappeared among the bushes. The weight of his past actions, the consequences of his unbridled ambition, all seemed to conspire to suffocate him. "There are more letters," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Mrs. Elizabeth left a complete trail. But we must be careful. Mr. Blackwood will stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden." Max began to gently scratch the wall next to the library. Richard approached and noticed something strange in the wood, a small panel that seemed to be loose. "Elizabeth always said that the walls of this house held as many secrets as the garden," Mrs. Peterson commented, approaching with a candle. Richard carefully removed the panel. Inside, he found an old diary with Elizabeth's handwriting. On the first page, an annotation caught his attention. "The truth about Daniel is only the beginning. There are more secrets that must come to light, more lives that were destroyed on the path to fortune. Max knows every corner where I kept the evidence. He will know when and how to reveal them." The Labrador sat next to Richard, his eyes fixed on the diary, as if he perfectly understood the importance of that moment. Outside, the shadows lengthened, and night began to fall over the Hawthorne mansion, bringing with it the promise of more revelations and the fear that Thomas was one step closer to discovering what Elizabeth had hidden so carefully. The light of dawn found Richard in his study, with Elizabeth's diary open on the desk and a cup of cold coffee forgotten to one side. He hadn't been able to sleep. His wife's words kept him captive, revealing a story he had chosen to ignore for years. Max dozed at his feet, but his ears moved occasionally, always alert. The Labrador had remained by his side throughout the night, as if he understood the importance of this moment of revelation. "October 15th, Richard read softly, his fingers tracing Elizabeth's delicate handwriting. "Today I saw Sarah at the downtown cafe. She's devastated. The company she and Daniel built over years was sold for a fraction of its value. All because of the falsified documents that Thomas prepared. My heart breaks to see how Richard's ambition has transformed him into someone I don't recognize. The pages of the diary revealed an Elizabeth who had been a silent witness to his transformation, a woman who had struggled internally between her loyalty to him and her sense of justice. "Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Peterson's soft voice interrupted his reading. The old woman entered with a tray of fresh coffee and some toast. "You must eat something. Mrs. Elizabeth wouldn't want to see you like this." Richard looked up, his eyes reddened from lack of sleep. "She knew everything, Mrs. Peterson, every manipulation, every lie, and yet she loved you," Mrs. Peterson completed, pouring the coffee. "That's why she left all these clues. She believed in your capacity for redemption." Max suddenly got up, heading towards the window. The rising sun bathed the garden in a golden light, and something glinted among the bushes. "There's someone out there," Richard whispered, approaching cautiously. A familiar figure was moving among the shadows. It was Robert, Daniel's former gardener. "Robert," Richard called out, stepping into the garden. The man startled, as if he'd been caught in the middle of something improper. "Mr. Hawthorne," Robert responded nervously. Mr. Blackwood sent me to check the state of the garden." Max growled softly, positioning himself between Robert and Richard. The old gardener looked at the dog with a mixture of fear and respect. "What is Thomas really looking for, Robert?" Richard asked, his voice firm but tired. The gardener hesitated for a moment, his eyes moving between Richard and Max. "Mr. Blackwood, he knows that Mrs. Elizabeth kept documents here, documents that could ruin him. And he sent you to look for them?" Robert nodded slowly. "He promised me a considerable sum. Said it was to protect everyone's interests, but..." His eyes moistened. "I worked for Mr. Roberts for 15 years. I saw how he and Mrs. Sarah lost everything. I can't keep being part of this." Max approached Robert, sniffing his extended hand. The gesture seemed to calm the gardener. "Mrs. Elizabeth," Robert continued, "she used to come talk to me while I tended the roses. She told me about her concerns, about how Mr. Blackwood had corrupted everything he touched. One day, shortly before she passed, she asked me to take special care of certain places in the garden." Richard felt his heart quicken. "What places?" "The main rosebush, the marble bench, and..." Robert pointed towards an old tree at the edge of the garden. "That walnut tree. She said that when the time came, Max would know what to do." As if he had understood his words, the Labrador headed towards the walnut tree, his tail moving with determination. "Mr. Blackwood will come today," Robert warned. "He asked me to prepare the ground for a garden renovation. He plans to dig up the entire place if necessary." Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening from the door, approached. "Then there's no time to lose. Robert, will you help us?" The gardener looked one last time towards the street, as if fearing being observed, and nodded. For Mr. Roberts and Mrs. Sarah, for everything they lost. Max had begun to dig near the walnut tree, his paws moving urgently. Richard knelt beside him, not caring that his expensive pants were stained with dirt. This time it wasn't just a medal or a ring they were looking for. It was the truth that Elizabeth had protected so carefully, the truth that could change everything. "Quickly," Mrs. Peterson whispered, looking towards the mansion's entrance. "Mr. Blackwood usually arrives early." Richard's hands joined Max's paws in the search, while the first lights of day illuminated the garden, and Thomas's threat loomed over them like a dark shadow. The first rays of sun barely pierced through the branches of the walnut tree when Richard's hands touched something solid in the disturbed earth. Max intensified his digging, as if sensing they were close to something important. Robert and Mrs. Peterson kept watch at the mansion's entrance, tense at Thomas's imminent arrival. "It's a box," Richard murmured, cleaning the dirt off a metal container larger than the previous ones. It was a safety deposit box, the kind used in banks with a combination system on top. Max sat next to Richard, panting from the effort, but his eyes remained fixed on the box as if he knew exactly what it contained. "Any idea about the combination?" Richard asked, more to himself than to the others. He turned the box in his hands, looking for any clue. "Mrs. Elizabeth," Robert intervened, approaching cautiously, "always talked about a special date when she came to this tree. She said this was where you proposed to her." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Of course, how could he forget? It was April 22nd, so many years ago. Elizabeth wore a light blue dress and the air smelled of freshly opened flowers. With trembling fingers, he dialed the date, 04/22. The box emitted a soft click and opened. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Mrs. Peterson's urgent voice came from the entrance. "Our car just stopped in front of the mansion." "Quick," Robert whispered. "Hide the box. I'll distract Mr. Blackwood." But before they could move, the contents of the box captured Richard's attention. Several sealed envelopes, an old USB drive, and a handwritten note from Elizabeth that said, "The truth never stays buried forever, my love. These are the proofs of everything." Max barked softly, alerting them to approaching footsteps in the garden. Robert hurried towards the entrance to intercept Thomas, while Mrs. Peterson helped Richard hide the documents in his jacket. "What a pleasant surprise to find you all so early in the garden." Thomas's voice resonated with false joviality. "I see Robert has already begun the inspection I requested." Richard slowly stood up, aware of the weight of the documents in his jacket. Max remained by his side, his posture tense but dignified. "Thomas," Richard greeted, trying to maintain calm. "I didn't expect to see you so early." "Good business doesn't wait, my friend," Thomas replied, his eyes scrutinizing the area around the walnut tree. "I see you've been busy." "Mr. Hawthorne wanted to check the state of the walnut tree's roots," Robert quickly intervened. "With so many years, it's important to ensure its stability." Thomas smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Of course, preservation is important. Although sometimes," his gaze fixed on Richard, "it's better to uproot things when they become problematic." Max growled softly, a low but unmistakably threatening sound. Thomas took a step back, his smile faltering for a moment. "Why don't we go to your office, Richard?" Thomas suggested, regaining his composure. "We have much to discuss about the future of this beautiful garden." "Of course," Richard replied, exchanging a significant look with Mrs. Peterson. "Robert, please continue with your work." As they walked towards the house, Richard could feel the weight of the documents in his jacket, as if they were made of lead. Max followed them closely, his steps silent but vigilant. In the office, Thomas sat with the familiarity of someone who feels like the owner of the place. "You know, Richard, I've been thinking about our shared past, about all the decisions we made together. Some were difficult, it's true, but necessary to get where we are." "Necessary?" Richard's voice had an edge that surprised even himself. "Like what we did to Daniel." Thomas's smile froze. "The past is the past, my friend." Although his eyes narrowed, "It seems you've been very interested in unearthing it lately." Max positioned himself between the two men, his presence like a protective shield. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing the office in a light that made the shadows of both men project long and dark across the floor. "There are things that can't remain buried forever, Thomas," said Richard, thinking of the documents he carried with him, and all the truths that Elizabeth had protected for so long. "You're right," Thomas responded, slowly rising. "That's why I've come personally today, to make sure that some things remain where they should be." The tension in the office was palpable. Max didn't take his eyes off Thomas, while Mrs. Peterson, who had remained at the door, nervously clutched her apron. In the garden, Robert continued digging, but now in a different place, trying to divert attention from the walnut tree and its newly discovered secrets. The silence in the office was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Thomas remained standing, his figure casting a threatening shadow over Richard's desk. Max hadn't moved from his protective position, his eyes fixed on every movement of the visitor. "You know, Richard," Thomas began, pulling a cigar from his jacket, "I always admired Elizabeth's dedication to the garden. She spent hours there, especially after..." Things changed with Daniel. Richard could feel the documents in his jacket as if they were burning. Elizabeth had a special gift for growing beautiful things. "And for keeping secrets, apparently," Thomas added, his voice taking on a darker tone. "It's fascinating how some people can seem so fragile and yet be so meticulous in their actions." Mrs. Peterson, who remained at the door, exchanged a significant look with Richard. The old woman knew they needed to buy time to review the found documents. "Mr. Blackwood," she intervened, "would you like some coffee? I've just prepared a special blend with those Colombian beans you're so fond of." Before Thomas could respond, Max suddenly rose, his ears alert. The sound of breaking glass came from the garden, followed by Robert's alarmed voice. "What was that?" Thomas asked, quickly heading towards the window. Richard took advantage of that moment to discreetly slide one of the envelopes out of his jacket, hiding it under some papers on his desk. Max stayed between him and Thomas as if he understood the importance of that movement. Probably Robert tripped over some of the flower pots, Mrs. Peterson suggested, moving towards the door. I'll go check. I'll come with you, Thomas hastened. After all, I'm very interested in everything that happens in this garden. As soon as they left the office, Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he found several financial documents and a handwritten note from Elizabeth. My love, if you're reading this, it means Max has fulfilled his mission. These documents are only part of the truth. They show how Thomas manipulated Daniel's company accounts, creating a false deficit that led him to ruin. But there's more. In the box, you'll also find evidence of other shady dealings, other lives that were destroyed on the path to wealth. It wasn't easy to gather this evidence. Thomas has eyes everywhere, but he underestimated what a seemingly fragile woman could discover while tending her garden. Each rose planted, each tree pruned was an opportunity to observe, to listen, to compile evidence. The USB drive contains recordings, conversations that Thomas had in this very garden, believing no one was listening, conversations that reveal the true nature of his business. Richard looked up from the letter upon hearing returning footsteps. He quickly put the documents in his desk drawer, locking it just as Thomas re-entered. Just a broken flower pot, Thomas reported, but his eyes scrutinized the room, looking for any sign of suspicious activity. Although it's curious how the simplest things can cause so much disorder. Max had moved towards the desk, his body practically covering the drawer where Richard had stored the documents. The dog maintained an apparent calm, but his muscles were tense, ready to act. Thomas, said Richard, slowly standing up, why are you really here? Can't an old friend be concerned about the state of another's garden? We both know this isn't about the garden. Thomas smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. You're right. I'm more concerned about what might be buried in it. Elizabeth was always an intelligent woman, Richard. Maybe too much for her own good. The implicit threat in his words made Max growl softly. Thomas looked at the dog with a mixture of annoyance and concern. That dog, he commented, seems to have a special instinct for protecting certain things. Elizabeth trained him well, didn't she? Before Richard could respond, Mrs. Peterson appeared at the door. Mr. Hawthorne, there's an urgent call for you. It's the family lawyer. The mention of the lawyer made Thomas visibly tense. Well, I won't interrupt you further, my friend, but I'll be back soon. There's much to discuss about the future of the garden. As Thomas headed towards the door, he paused for a moment. By the way, Richard, did you know that roses need a deep pruning from time to time? Sometimes you have to cut all the way to the roots to keep the garden clean. Max followed Thomas with his gaze until he disappeared down the hallway. Only then did Richard allow himself to release the breath he had been holding. There's no call, is there? He asked Mrs. Peterson. No, sir, but we needed him to leave. Robert found something else by the walnut tree. Something you should see immediately. Richard followed Mrs. Peterson to the garden, with Max faithfully trotting by his side. The mid-morning sun cast dancing shadows through the branches of the walnut tree, where Robert waited with a worried expression. Mr. Hawthorne, Robert whispered, nervously glancing towards the mansion's entrance to ensure Thomas had left. When I was pretending to check the tree's roots, I found this. The gardener pointed to a hole between the oldest roots of the walnut tree. There, partially hidden by years of natural growth, was a small metal door, similar to the entrance of an old bunker. Elizabeth, Richard murmured, kneeling to examine the discovery better. She once mentioned that her father had built a shelter during the war era, but I thought it was just a story. Max approached the door and began to scratch its surface gently, as if recognizing the place. His actions had a clear purpose, a determination that suggested he had been there before. Mrs. Elizabeth spent a lot of time here, Mrs. Peterson commented, her eyes shining with contained tears, especially in her last months. I thought she was seeking the tranquility of the garden, but now... Richard tried to open the door, but it was firmly locked. Next to it was an old numeric panel covered by years of moss and dirt. Any idea of the code? Robert asked while keeping watch on the surroundings. Max barked softly and headed towards a specific point in the garden near a small rose bush. He began to dig with determination. Wait, boy. Richard approached and helped Max in his task. Soon they found a small rusted metal plate with engraved numbers. Their coordinates, Robert observed, cleaning the plate. And a date, September 15th. Richard felt his heart stop for a moment. Daniel's birthday, Elizabeth. She knew I would never forget that date, no matter how much I tried to bury the past. With trembling fingers, Richard entered the date on the panel, 915. The door emitted a soft click and opened with a metallic creak. The interior was a small space, no larger than a closet, but the walls were covered with shelves. On them, dozens of carefully labeled and chronologically organized folders. There was also an old laptop and several boxes of documents. "It's an archive," Mrs. Peterson whispered in amazement. "Mrs. Elizabeth built her own secret archive." Max entered the small space and went directly to one of the boxes marked with a red label. He gently pushed it with his muzzle towards Richard. Inside the box, Richard found something that chilled his blood. Photographs of Thomas in secret meetings, financial documents with Elizabeth's detailed annotations, and most shockingly, a series of letters written by Sarah, Daniel's wife. "Dear Elizabeth," Richard read aloud, his hands shaking, "the evidence you've gathered confirms what we always suspected. Thomas not only forged the documents that ruined Daniel, but he has been using the company as a front for questionable operations. Each new real estate project hides a darker secret than the previous one." A noise at the garden entrance interrupted the reading. Robert cautiously peeked out. "It's Mr. Blackwood's car," he whispered urgently. "He's back. Quickly, Mrs. Peterson indicated. "We must close this before he discovers us." Richard grabbed the red-marked box and some additional folders. Max took an envelope that had fallen to the floor between his teeth, as if he knew exactly what was important to save. As they hurriedly closed the secret door and covered it with fallen leaves, they could hear Thomas's voice approaching along the main path. "Richard," Thomas called out, "I've forgotten to discuss an important detail about the garden renovation." Max strategically positioned himself in front of the walnut tree, while Robert pretended to prune some nearby bushes and Mrs. Peterson scattered some seeds for the birds, in a scene that attempted to appear ordinary. Richard, with his heart beating rapidly and the documents hidden under his jacket, prepared to face Thomas again. The words from Elizabeth in the newly discovered letters resonated in his mind, along with the terrible realization that the danger was much greater than he had imagined. Max remained firm by his side, the envelope still in his mouth, his eyes fixed on Thomas's figure, approaching along the garden path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn, like omens of the secrets that still remained to be revealed. Thomas approached along the garden path with deliberately slow steps, like a predator assessing its territory. His eyes scrutinized every detail of the landscape, pausing briefly on areas where the earth appeared disturbed. "Richard," he called again, his voice mixing false cordiality with a threatening undertone. "I remembered something important about the old garden plans." Max remained motionless next to Richard, the envelope still protected in his mouth. Robert continued his feigned pruning work, while Mrs. Peterson scattered more bird seeds, her slightly trembling hands betraying her nervousness. "Thomas," Richard responded, trying to maintain calm despite the weight of the hidden documents under his jacket. "I didn't know you were so interested in the garden's history." "Oh, old gardens always hold fascinating secrets," Thomas smiled, approaching the walnut tree. "Especially those that have been carefully maintained over the years." Max let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, but enough to make Thomas stop at a prudent distance. "That dog," Thomas commented, "seems especially protective today. I wonder what treasure he thinks he's guarding." At that moment, the envelope in Max's mouth caught Thomas's attention. His eyes narrowed, recognizing the yellowed paper and the particular seal that Elizabeth used to use on her correspondence. "Interesting," he murmured, taking a step forward. "What do you have there, furry friend?" Before Thomas could get any closer, Mrs. Peterson intervened. "Mr. Blackwood, would you like to see the new rose bushes we planted near the fountain? They're a special variety that Mrs. Elizabeth ordered before." "The rose bushes can wait," Thomas cut her off dryly. "I'm more interested in recent findings." Robert, who had been observing the scene with growing concern, accidentally dropped his pruning shears, creating a momentary distraction that Richard took advantage of to take the envelope from Max's mouth and store it with the other documents. "Thomas," Richard said, his voice acquiring a firm tone that surprised even himself, "why don't you tell me what you're really looking for?" Looking for? Thomas laughed softly. I'm just trying to protect our mutual interests, my friend. After all, we share a long history of successful collaboration. You mean how we collaborated to destroy Daniel? The garden seemed to fall into a sepulchral silence. Even the birds stopped singing for a moment. I see someone has been digging up more than plants, Thomas responded, his mask of cordiality beginning to crack. You should be careful, Richard. Some truths are like poisonous plants. They can cause a lot of damage if allowed to grow. Max moved slightly, positioning himself between the two men. His brown eyes, normally warm and friendly, showed an iron determination. Elizabeth knew everything, Richard continued, gaining confidence. Every false document, every manipulation, every shady deal. She documented it all. Thomas's face paled for an instant, but he quickly regained his composure. Elizabeth always had a very active imagination. Who would believe the conspiracy theories of a woman who spent her days talking to a dog and burying treasures in her garden? I would believe her, a voice intervened from the garden entrance. Everyone turned in surprise. There, standing with a folder in her hands, was Sarah, Daniel's wife. Her elegant and upright figure contrasted with the memory Richard held of her, a woman shattered by scandal and betrayal. Sarah, Richard whispered, while Max wagged his tail in recognition. I've kept silent for too long, Sarah said, advancing with a firm step. Elizabeth wasn't alone in her search for the truth. Every letter we exchanged, every piece of evidence we gathered, every testimony we collected meant it's all here. Thomas took a step back, his confidence visibly shaken. This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything. Are you sure? Sarah asked, opening the folder. What about the photographs of your secret meetings, the original documents you falsified? The recordings that Elizabeth kept so carefully? Max barked once as if wanting to confirm Sarah's words. The garden, a silent witness to so many secrets, seemed to hold its breath as the truth, long buried, finally came to light. The garden of the Hawthorne mansion, which had guarded so many secrets, was now witness to a moment that would change everything. Sarah advanced with a firm step, her presence transforming the atmosphere. Max approached her, gently wagging his tail in recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment. 15 years, Sarah said, her voice clear and firm. 15 years waiting for the right moment. Elizabeth and I never stopped seeking the truth, Thomas. Every move you made, every document you hid, every shady deal you conducted, everything was recorded. Thomas tried to maintain his composure, but a nervous tick in his cheek betrayed his unease. The fantasies of two resentful women have no legal value, dear Sarah. Fantasies? Sarah smiled ironically, pulling out more documents from her folder. What about the signed testimonies of your former employees, the bank transfers to ghost accounts, the original contracts you falsified? Richard observed the scene with a mixture of astonishment and remorse. Every word from Sarah was like a mirror reflecting his own mistakes, his complicity in the destruction of innocent lives. Elizabeth was more astute than anyone imagined, Sarah continued, approaching the walnut tree. While everyone saw a woman dedicated to her garden, she was building a solid case against you. Every rose planted was an opportunity to observe, every meeting in the garden a chance to record compromising conversations. Mrs. Peterson, who had remained silent, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. The mistress spent hours in her study, organizing documents, writing in her diary. I helped her hide the evidence in different places in the garden. And Max, Sarah added, stroking the Labrador's head, was her most faithful guardian. Elizabeth trained him specifically to recognize and protect each hiding place. She knew the day would come when we would need to find everything again. Thomas let out a forced laugh, but sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. This is absurd. Richard, old friend, surely you don't believe these fanciful stories. But Richard was no longer the same man who had chosen ambition over integrity. The documents in his jacket, Sarah's words, Max's loyal presence, all combined to show him a truth he could no longer deny. I believe them, Thomas, Richard responded, his voice laden with determination. And more importantly, I have proof of them. Sarah nodded, pulling out a small recording device from her purse. Elizabeth didn't just keep documents. She also recorded every important conversation that took place in this garden, including the one where you planned Daniel's destruction. Thomas's face transformed, all pretense of calm disappearing. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I? Sarah challenged. To seek justice? To reveal how you destroyed an honest man's life out of ambition? Copies of all the evidence are in safe hands, Thomas. One false move and everything will come to light. Max barked softly, as if supporting Sarah's words. The dog moved towards the walnut tree, where so many secrets had remained hidden, and began to gently scratch the earth. There's more, said Sarah, following the dog. Elizabeth left a complete record of every fraudulent real estate project, every bribe, every threat. It wasn't just about Daniel, was it, Thomas? There were many more victims. Robert, who had been observing in silence, stepped forward. It's true. I myself witnessed many conversations in this garden. Mr. Blackwood never paid attention to the old gardener, but I listened and Mrs. Elizabeth knew it. Mrs. Peterson approached Richard, holding a small antique key. Mrs. Elizabeth gave me this before she passed. She said that when the time came, I would know what to do with it. The key to her secret desk, Sarah whispered, where she kept the most important evidence. Thomas looked around like a cornered animal. His empire of lies was beginning to crumble, and for the first time fear was visible in his eyes. This isn't over, Thomas threatened, backing towards the garden exit. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Max planted himself firmly between Thomas and the others, his posture protective yet dignified. The message was clear. The time for threats had ended. You're wrong, Thomas, Richard responded, placing a hand on Max's back. This is ending. And it's time for the truth to come to light. Thomas's abrupt departure left a dense silence in the garden. Richard sank onto the marble bench, the weight of the revelations crushing his shoulders. Max immediately approached, resting his head on his master's knees, offering that unconditional comfort that had always been his specialty. All this time, Richard murmured, his eyes fixed on the roses Elizabeth had loved so much. She knew everything. She saw what I was becoming, and yet she never lost hope in you, Sarah completed, sitting beside him. Elizabeth always said that the man she fell in love with was still there, buried under layers of ambition and fear. Mrs. Peterson approached with a carved wooden box that Richard immediately recognized. It was where Elizabeth kept her most precious treasures. The mistress asked me to keep this, said the old woman, opening the box with trembling hands. She said the time would come when it would be necessary. Inside was a diary different from the others, bound in blue leather, Elizabeth's favorite color. On the first page, a photograph, Richard and Daniel together, smiling the day they opened their first office. We were like brothers, Richard whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers, before money and power ruined everything. Max barked softly and headed towards another point in the garden, near a particularly lush rose bush. Sarah smiled, recognizing the dog's behavior. There's still more to show, isn't there, old friend? She said, following the Labrador. Elizabeth created an intricate network of evidence and memories. Every corner of the garden holds a piece of the puzzle. Robert, who had been watching the garden entrance, approached cautiously. Mr. Hawthorne, you should know something. Mr. Daniel. He lives in a small town up north. He never stopped thinking about the company you built together. The revelation hit Richard like a wave. He's alive? I thought he had passed away. Sarah smiled sadly. No. Daniel chose anonymity, a simple life away from all this. But he never lost hope that someday the truth would come to light. Max had begun digging near the rosebush and soon uncovered a small metal box. Inside were more letters, but these were different. They were written by Daniel and addressed to Elizabeth. Dear Elizabeth, Sarah read aloud, holding one of the letters. Sometimes I wonder if Richard remembers who we were before money changed everything. Does he remember the nights we spent planning how our company would help the community, the social projects we wanted to implement? I keep those memories as treasures, hoping that someday my friend will find his way back to himself. Tears were flowing freely down Richard's face. Each word was a reminder of the dreams he had betrayed, of the friendship he had destroyed. Elizabeth didn't just collect evidence of Thomas's crimes, Sarah explained. She also gathered proof of the original projects, the plans you and Daniel had to do good. She believed that someday you would need to remember who you truly were. Mrs. Peterson approached with a cup of hot tea, her way of offering comfort in difficult moments. Mrs. Elizabeth always said that there's no evil that can't be repaired if there's true repentance. Max returned to Richard's side, bringing something else between his teeth, An old notebook, worn by time. It was the notebook where Richard and Daniel had sketched their first projects, full of ideas to create affordable housing, community spaces, social aid programs. "This is the true legacy you should preserve," Sarah said softly. "Not the empire built on lies, but the dreams you once shared with Daniel." Richard stroked Max's back, finding strength in the dog's constant presence. Do you think Daniel would be willing to see me?" Sarah exchanged a significant look with Mrs. Peterson. "Elizabeth prepared everything, Richard. Even that. In her last year, she established a trust fund with part of her personal fortune. The condition to activate it was that the truth would come to light and that you would be willing to make peace with the past." Max barked, as if wanting to confirm Sarah's words, and headed towards the house. Everyone understood the message. There was more to discover, more truths to face. Evening fell over the mansion as Richard, seated in his study, reviewed the trust fund documents that Elizabeth had prepared. Max rested at his feet, but his ears moved occasionally, attentive to every sound in the house. "It's incredible how meticulously Elizabeth planned everything," Sarah commented, who had agreed to stay to help organize the next steps. The trust fund not only contemplates economic restitution to Daniel, but also a complete plan to reform the company according to the original ideals. Mrs. Peterson entered with a tray of fresh coffee and paused for a moment, observing the papers scattered across the desk. Mrs. Elizabeth spent entire nights working on those documents. She said she was building a bridge to the future. "A bridge to redemption," Richard murmured, absent-mindedly stroking Max's ears. "But how will I face Daniel after everything I did?" Max suddenly got up and headed towards the library. With his muzzle, he pushed a book until it fell to the floor. It was an old photo album that Richard didn't remember seeing before. "Mrs. Elizabeth prepared it especially," explained Mrs. Peterson, picking up the album. "She said it would be important when the time came." Upon opening it, they found a collection of photographs documenting the company's early years. Richard and Daniel handing over keys to social housing to needy families, inaugurating community centers, celebrating with their employees. In each image, the faces reflected the pride of building something meaningful. "This is the legacy we must recover," Richard said firmly. "Not just for Daniel or for Elizabeth, but for all those who believed in our original vision." Sarah smiled, pulling an envelope from her purse. Elizabeth thought of everything. "Here's Daniel's address, along with a letter she wrote to him shortly before she passed. She never sent it, waiting for the right moment." Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. "Do you think he'll receive me?" "Elizabeth believed so," Sarah replied. "That's why she set up the trust fund this way. The first phase involves you taking the first step, demonstrating your repentance through actions." Max barked softly and headed towards the door leading to the garden. The three followed the dog to the walnut tree, where everything had begun. "Before going to see Daniel," Sarah suggested, "you should implement the changes Elizabeth proposed in the trust fund. Demonstrate that your intentions are sincere." Richard nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to call my lawyer right now. We'll start the process of restructuring the company and the formal investigation of all of Thomas's activities." "And the social projects," added Mrs. Peterson. "The ones you and Mr. Daniel dreamed of creating." "Yes," Richard confirmed. "We'll recover each of those projects. Elizabeth's trust fund provides the perfect legal framework to do it." Max approached a particular rose bush, one that Elizabeth had planted the year before she passed. He began to dig gently, revealing a small metal box. Inside, they found a notebook with Elizabeth's handwriting, dated in her final days. "My dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back to yourself. Money and power can build empires, but only love and integrity can build a true legacy. Daniel awaits you in the town of Pine Grove, in the house next to the old oak tree. Every morning he sits on his porch to contemplate the sunrise, remembering the dreams you once shared. Go to him with an open heart and the will to rebuild." Richard closed the notebook, a new determination shining in his eyes. "I need to prepare everything before going to see him. Every document, every piece of evidence, every restitution plan must be ready." "And Max," Sarah added with a smile, "will he go with you?" The Labrador wagged his tail, as if he understood the question. Richard knelt beside his faithful companion, hugging him tightly. "Of course he'll come. Max has been the guardian of the truth all this time. He deserves to be part of the reconciliation." As the sun set over the garden, Richard began working on the documents necessary for the restructuring. Each signature, each decision, was another step towards the redemption that Elizabeth had foreseen. Max remained by his side, vigilant and faithful as he had always been, while Elizabeth's legacy began to take shape in concrete actions of change and restoration. The town of Pine Grove appeared before them with the first light of dawn. Richard drove slowly, his hands tense on the steering wheel, while Max observed the landscape from the passenger seat. The 3-hour journey from the mansion had been filled with reflective silences and memories that surfaced with each mile traveled. "This is it," Richard murmured, stopping the car in front of a modest 2-story house. Just as Elizabeth had written, an imposing oak tree dominated the front yard, its branches casting dancing shadows over the porch, where a solitary figure contemplated the sunrise. Daniel. The years had silvered his hair and drawn new lines on his face, but his posture still conveyed the same dignity that Richard remembered. He was sitting in a wooden rocking chair, holding a cup of coffee, apparently lost in thought. Max was the first to move. Before Richard could stop him, the Labrador jumped out of the car and headed towards the porch with a determined stride. Daniel stood up as he saw the dog, a smile of recognition lighting up his face. "Max," he whispered, leaning down to pet the animal. "Elizabeth told me so much about you in her letters." Richard got out of the car on shaky legs, holding the briefcase containing all the documents, the evidence gathered by Elizabeth, the trust fund plans, the restitution projects. But upon seeing his old friend, he understood that no paper could express what he needed to say. "Daniel," his voice barely a whisper. Time seemed to stand still. Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting Richard's for the first time in 15 years. There was no hatred in his gaze, only a deep sadness mixed with something else. Hope. "Elizabeth wrote to me that this day would come," Daniel finally said, his voice serene. "That when Max appeared at my door, it would mean you were ready to talk." Max sat between the two men, like a living bridge between the past and the present. His presence seemed to create a safe space for the words that had waited so long to be said. "I'm sorry," Richard began, the words flowing from the depths of his being. "I'm sorry for every wrong decision, for every betrayal, for having allowed ambition to destroy our friendship." Daniel listened in silence, his fingers interlaced on his lap. The sun continued its ascent, bathing the porch in a golden light that reminded of the sunrises they had shared in the office, planning a better future. "Elizabeth never lost faith in you," Daniel said after a long moment. "Even when I had lost all hope, she insisted that someday you would remember who you really were." Richard took a step forward, opening the briefcase. "I bring with me all the evidence Elizabeth collected, the trust fund documents she established, the plans to restore everything we destroyed." "The papers can wait," Daniel gently interrupted. "First, tell me, what made you wake up?" Max approached Richard, resting his head against his leg in support. And so, under the oak tree that had witnessed so many of Daniel's solitary mornings, Richard began to narrate everything. Max's strange behavior, the discoveries in the garden, Elizabeth's letters, Sarah's arrival, the truth about Thomas. Daniel listened attentively, his eyes occasionally glistening with unshed tears. Max moved between both men, as if wanting to ensure that the fragile bridge between them would not break. "Do you remember our first project?" Daniel asked suddenly. "The housing for low-income families in the Riverside neighborhood." "How could I forget?" Richard responded. "The joy on those families' faces when we handed them the keys. That was our true success," Daniel said. "Not the millions in the bank account, but the difference we could make in people's lives." Max barked softly, as if supporting Daniel's words. The dog headed towards the backyard of the house, inviting both men to follow him. "He always does that," Daniel smiled. "Every time Elizabeth came to visit me, Max would guide us to the garden. She said some conversations need nature's embrace to flourish." Following the Labrador, the two men walked to the garden, where a small greenhouse housed dozens of plants in different stages of growth. "This is my new project," Daniel explained. "I grow medicinal plants for the local community clinic. It's not building skyscrapers, but it's still a way to help others." Richard observed the plants with new eyes, remembering how he and Daniel used to dream of projects that would benefit the community. Max sat among the planters, his presence a constant reminder of Elizabeth's legacy and the path to redemption she had so carefully mapped out. Daniel's greenhouse became the place where they began to rebuild not only their friendship, but also the dreams they once shared. Seated among the medicinal plants, with Max resting peacefully between them, they reviewed the documents Richard had brought. Elizabeth thought of everything, Daniel commented, examining the trust fund plans. She not only foresaw economic restitution, but also a complete restructuring of the company to return to its original values. She never lost sight of our initial vision, Richard replied, pulling more papers from his briefcase. Look at this. These are the original plans for our first social housing project, with Elizabeth's annotations on how we could expand and improve it. Max raised his head, suddenly alert, and headed towards the greenhouse entrance. Sarah appeared moments later, carrying a box with more documents. I thought you might need this, she said, placing the box on the work table. These are the feasibility studies Elizabeth commissioned for the new community projects. Daniel smiled, recognizing Elizabeth's meticulousness in every detail. Even from her departure, she continues to guide us towards the right path. And not just that, Sarah added, pulling out an additional envelope. She also prepared a plan to legally confront Thomas. Each document is backed up. Each accusation has solid evidence. Richard nodded gravely. I've already put my legal team to work on it. Thomas won't be able to escape this time. Max approached a particular corner of the greenhouse where small lavender plants were growing. Daniel observed him with a nostalgic smile. Elizabeth planted those lavenders the last time she came, he explained. She said their aroma reminded her of the early days of our company, when everything was possible and our hearts were full of purpose. We can recover that purpose, Richard said with renewed determination. The trust fund gives us the legal structure, we have the resources, and more importantly, we have the opportunity to correct our mistakes. Sarah unfolded a map of the city on the table. Elizabeth identified several areas where we could resume the social projects, communities that need decent housing, spaces for community centers, clinics. Like in the old days, Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with the enthusiasm that Richard remembered so well. But this time with the wisdom that years and mistakes have given us. Max barked softly, as if approving the direction the conversation was taking. He approached the table and rested his head on the plans, his presence a constant reminder of Elizabeth's legacy. There's something else you should see, said Sarah, pulling a tablet from her bag. Elizabeth left a video recorded shortly before her passing. She wanted you to watch it together when this moment arrived. Elizabeth's face appeared on the screen, her eyes bright despite her evident fatigue. My dear Richard and Daniel, if you're watching this, it means that Max has fulfilled his mission. That you're finally together again, ready to rebuild not only your friendship, but also the dream you once shared. Elizabeth's words filled the greenhouse, mixing with the aroma of medicinal herbs and the sunlight filtering through the glass. Max sat up straight, as if recognizing the voice of his former owner. I never lost faith that this day would come, Elizabeth continued in the video. The company you created was born from a genuine desire to do good, to build not just buildings but communities. That dream didn't die. It was just dormant, waiting for the right moment to be reborn. Richard and Daniel listened in silence, tears flowing freely down their faces. Sarah watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and hope, while Max gently wagged his tail, as if understanding the importance of the moment. The trust fund I've established, Elizabeth explained, is not just a legal mechanism for restitution, it's a bridge to the future, an opportunity for both of you to recover not only your friendship, but also your purpose. Every project, every decision, every step you take from now on can be a seed of change. The recording ended with Elizabeth smiling softly, her gaze full of love and confidence in the future she had helped build. The silence that followed was full of promises and possibilities. So, Daniel finally said, extending his hand to Richard, are you ready to start building dreams again? Richard took his old friend's hand, feeling the weight of years of separation dissolve in that simple gesture. More than ever. Max approached both of them, his presence completing the circle of reconciliation and renewal that Elizabeth had foreseen so clearly. A week after the reunion, the old boardroom of Hawthorne Enterprises had been transformed into an operations center for change. Plans and documents covered the walls, while Richard, Daniel, and Sarah worked tirelessly on implementing the trust fund projects. Max, as always, remained attentive to everything, moving among the people like a silent guardian of Elizabeth's legacy. His constant presence seemed to keep alive the spirit of renewal that drove every decision. The first project should be here. Daniel pointed on the map spread out on the table, the riverside neighborhood where it all began. Many of the families we helped still live there, and the community has grown. Richard nodded, remembering the happy faces from those first housing handovers. Elizabeth left a complete study on the neighborhood's current needs. They not only need more housing, but also a community center and a clinic. "And I have good news," Sarah interjected, entering the room with a folder. "The legal team has managed to freeze all of Thomas's assets." The evidence Elizabeth gathered was irrefutable. Max's ears perked up at the mention of Thomas, but he quickly relaxed again when Robert, the former gardener, entered with new blueprints. "Mr. Daniel, Mr. Richard," Robert said with a smile, "the architects have finished the preliminary designs for the community center." They incorporated all the suggestions from the neighbors. The design showed a modern yet welcoming building, with integrated green spaces reminiscent of Elizabeth's garden. Large windows would allow natural light to flood the common areas, and there was space for a community garden similar to Daniel's greenhouse. "It's perfect," Richard murmured. Elizabeth always said that spaces should nourish both body and soul. Mrs. Peterson, who was now actively participating in the projects, entered with a tray of coffee. "The families in the neighborhood are excited when they found out you two were working together again. It's like the circle is closing," Daniel completed. "But this time we'll do things right." Max approached the window, where the sun's rays illuminated a framed photograph of Elizabeth in the garden. Her gaze seemed to approve every step they were taking towards renewal. "The trust fund is officially activated," Sarah announced, reviewing some documents on her tablet. "The funds are available to start the Riverside Neighborhood project immediately." "And there's more," Richard added, pulling a folder from his desk drawer. "I've decided to transform the mansion's garden into a public park, a green space where families can gather, where children can play, where dreams can grow." Daniel smiled, understanding the symbolism of the gesture. Max barked softly, as if approving the decision. He headed towards a corner of the room where there was a model of the future park, with Elizabeth's walnut tree as the central point. "Elizabeth's rose bushes will be the heart of the park," Richard explained. "And the walnut tree, with all its secrets and memories, will be a reminder of how truth always finds its way to the light." A group of residents from the Riverside neighborhood was waiting in the reception area for the first participatory planning meeting. Richard and Daniel exchanged a knowing look before heading out to greet them. "Remember what we used to say when we started?" Daniel asked as they walked. "We build more than buildings," Richard responded. "We build hopes." Max followed them, his tail wagging enthusiastically. The dog seemed to sense that his mission was nearing completion. He was no longer just the guardian of Elizabeth's secrets, but also the witness to a new beginning. The meeting room soon filled with hopeful voices and renewed dreams. The neighbors shared their ideas and needs, while Richard and Daniel listened attentively, taking notes and asking questions. The spirit of collaboration and purpose that had marked the beginnings of their company was present once again. "Elizabeth would be proud," Sarah whispered to Mrs. Peterson, observing the scene. "She always knew this day would come," the old woman replied, looking fondly at Max, who had sat between Richard and Daniel, like a living bridge between the past and the future. "That's why she left us Max as the guardian of her vision." 6 months had passed since that dawn in Pine Grove. The garden of the Hawthorne Mansion, now transformed into Elizabeth Memorial Park, was bustling with life on its inauguration day. Families strolled along carefully designed paths, children played near the newly installed fountain, and the old walnut tree, silent witness to so many secrets, stood majestic at the center of the park. Max, a bit slower due to age but with the same dignity as always, walked alongside Richard and Daniel as they supervised the final details of the inauguration. His brown eyes shone with special satisfaction, as if he knew his mission was accomplished. "It's incredible how Elizabeth foresaw all of this," Daniel commented, watching a group of children planting new rose bushes under Robert's guidance. "Not just the reconciliation, but the complete transformation." Richard nodded, stroking Max's ears. "Every rose, every tree, every corner of this park tells a story of redemption and renewal." Sarah approached them, holding a folder with the latest reports. The community center in Riverside is almost finished, and the clinic will start operating next month. The families can't believe the transformation. Richard's former corporate empire had become a foundation dedicated to social development. Thomas, faced with the irrefutable evidence gathered by Elizabeth, had accepted an agreement that included full restitution to all the people affected by his actions. "You know what's most beautiful?" Mrs. Peterson interjected, who had approached with a tray of refreshments. "Seeing how the dreams you had at the beginning are finally coming true." Max barked softly and headed towards the walnut tree. The others followed him, understanding the importance of the moment. Under the tree, a bronze plaque shone with a special inscription: "In memory of Elizabeth Hawthorne, whose love and wisdom taught us that truth, like roses, needs time and care to bloom. And in honor of Max, the faithful guardian of her dreams." The Labrador sat next to the plaque, his posture proud and serene. In his eyes was reflected a deep peace, as if he knew that the circle had finally closed. "There's something else you should see," said Sarah, pulling an envelope from her purse. "I found this letter this morning in the last corner of Elizabeth's secret archive." The letter, dated a few days before her passing, was addressed to all of them. "My dear friends, if you're reading this, it means the garden has revealed all its secrets, and that love has triumphed over ambition. Max, my faithful companion, will have fulfilled his mission as guardian of truth and love. Richard, my love, I knew you would find your way back to your true self. Fortune and power are mirages that can temporarily blind, but the heart always remembers its true purpose. Daniel, your strength and dignity were always an inspiration. Your ability to keep hope alive even in the darkest moments gave me the strength to weave this network of truth and redemption. Sarah, Robert, Mrs. Peterson, faithful friends and accomplices in this mission of love, thank you for helping me preserve hope and protect the truth until the right moment came. And Max, my dear guardian, your unconditional love and instinctive wisdom were the bridge we needed to reconnect broken hearts and heal the wounds of the past. The garden I loved so much will now transform into a space where new dreams can flourish. Every rose, every tree, every corner will be a testimony that true love never dies. It only transforms and grows in new ways. Take care of each other. Continue building on this foundation of truth and reconciliation. And always remember that the most beautiful gardens are those cultivated with love, patience, and purpose. With eternal love, Elizabeth." As Richard finished reading the letter, a gentle breeze rustled the roses, filling the air with their fragrance. Max stood up and walked among those present, touching each one with his muzzle, as if giving his own blessing. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden light as families continued to arrive for the inauguration. From the community center came the laughter of children participating in new workshops, and in the air was a sense of possibility and hope. "Max," Richard called softly, "you did it, friend. You fulfilled your mission." The Labrador wagged his tail and rested his head on his master's knee, his eyes full of love and satisfaction. Truth had found its way to the light, broken hearts had healed, and Elizabeth's legacy bloomed in every corner of the garden that now belonged to everyone. On the horizon, the sun began to set, painting the sky with pink and golden hues. It was a sunset that marked not an end, but a new beginning, and at the heart of the park, under the old walnut tree, Max rested peacefully, knowing that his mission as guardian of love and truth was complete.